Hello, this is John Hesse, Cahokia Presbyterian Church. I'd like to read from Of Moose and Men by Tori Martin and Doug Peterson. And this is chapter 1, The Prodigal Reindeer. The 400-pound reindeer was going berserk, desperately trying to get out of my kitchen. Wild-eyed, it bashed me against the counters and appliances as it tried to turn around in my tiny kitchen, its feet slipping and sliding on the slick floor, its black hooves clicking on the plywood like tap shoes. Now freeze frame the scene. That's me there. I'm the one without the antlers. The bearded, extra-large, hippie-looking human being with blazing red hair flying in every direction, mouth wide open in horror. I look like a frightened Bigfoot in overalls. So how did I find myself in this predicament? How did I wind up with a full-grown reindeer in my kitchen? It started when I first opened my eyes on this cold, cold morning. It always seemed to be cold in Bear Valley, just southeast of Anchorage, Alaska. And on mornings like this, I could think of nothing better to do than hibernate. Bears can hibernate because they don't have a phone by their bed to disturb them. But I wasn't quite so lucky. The ring of the phone slapped me out of my slumber, and I clumsily put the receiver up to my ear and growled something that was clearly unintelligible. You probably would have gotten a better response from an actual bear. My best friend and co-cabin dweller, Robert Browning, no relation to the poet, was on the other end of the line telling me something about a reindeer, but I was lost in a fog of sleep. He said something about looking outside the window. But all I remember saying is, yeah, I'll be sure to do that just as soon as I wake up. Right now, my pillow is missing me. Then I hung up the phone, closed my eyes, and got back to the serious business of hibernating. A half hour later, the phone rang again. It was Rob. "Did you take care of the reindeer?" he asked. "That's Santa's job," I said, getting ready to hang up again. But this time, he wasn't going to be so easily dismissed. Rob's voice rose 100 decibels or more. "Get out of bed and look out the window now!" Then he slammed down the phone with such force that I'm surprised that the sound from the receiver didn't dislodge the snow from the roof. That woke me up. I crawled out of bed and stumbled to the window. There, I saw a rather large reindeer wearing a bridle. It was standing just a few feet from the window and calmly staring back at me. It was a peeping reindeer. I quickly pulled on my pants just in case he had a camera. This time, it was my turn to make the phone call. "Rob," I said, "there's a reindeer outside our window." I could hear the groan of exasperation. I learned that Rob had discovered the reindeer on his way down to the main road earlier that morning. We lived in an odd little L-shaped cabin on 80 acres of Alaskan wilderness, and he had come across the window on his way to his truck. The animal wore a bridle and a collar, so it obviously belonged to someone. Rob had patiently walked the reindeer all the way back to our cabin and tied it to a tree using a tow strap from his truck. Then he took off for work, figuring he would call me on his way and have me take care of it. "What am I supposed to do with a reindeer? Buy a sleigh?" I asked Rob. "How do you even know it's safe? That thing's the size of a pony." "Stop freaking out. He's tame," Rob said, probably repeating what he'd already said before on the phone when I was half asleep. "There's a collar on him with a tag and a phone number. Go get the number and call the owner." Rob also suggested I dig out some carrots and other vegetables from the refrigerator to feed the reindeer. So I did as I was told and went back outside. Never did I imagine in all my years of living in Los Angeles that I would be standing in snowdrifts in the middle of a forest feeding carrots to an Alaskan reindeer. Rob was right. The reindeer was friendly, almost puppy-like. But I didn't have a pen and paper to write down the number from the reindeer's collar, so I headed back to the cabin. Then came my crucial mistake. I decided to bring the reindeer into the cabin to save myself a trip back outside and to share the indoor warmth with this large creature. I figured he must be as cold as me. You know, sometimes it's worth taking an extra trip. The front door to the cabin led directly into our tiny kitchen, and when I opened the door, the reindeer happily marched inside as if I'd just opened a barn door. but I hadn't really thought through what I was doing. If I'd taken time to think through, I would have remembered one important wild card: Sam. Sam was our dog, and not a small one either. Sam was part Labrador, part Airedale, and all big. Now, up to this point of the story, Sam had been lounging on the sofa in the living room, watching out the window and thinking typical dog thoughts, which were probably more advanced than my thoughts on this frosty morning. I'm sure he was wondering why I was leading this strange animal through the front door of his personal kingdom. Sam didn't charge us rent to live in his domain, but if he had given us a lease to sign, it definitely would have said, "Absolutely no reindeer in the cabin." The moment the reindeer clumped into the kitchen, Sam came charging in our direction, barking and snarling like a dog possessed. The reindeer panicked. Not a good thing to happen in such a small kitchen. To give you an idea of the size of our kitchen, I could put my foot on the wall on one side and reach out and touch the wall on the other side. The kitchen had not been designed to hold a 130-pound dog, a several hundred-pound reindeer, and a human being that weighed approximately, well, let's not go there. You get the idea. Sam was not going to let that reindeer get any further into the house, and the poor creature must have thought I'd intentionally let him into a trap. So the reindeer did what any animal would do when trapped in a tiny kitchen. He went nuts. He decided he had to get outside immediately, and he didn't care who stood in his way, which would be me. My kitchen became a pinball machine, and I was the pinball. The reindeer's muscular body slammed me into the wall. Ouch! Then he sent me hurtling against the kitchen cabinets. Another ouch. Then I felt the impact of the kitchen counter against my side. I could almost hear the ding, ding, ding of the pinball machine as I caromed from one side of the kitchen to the other. Then I hit the refrigerator. On top of the refrigerator sat a large plastic container in which we stored approximately 50 pounds of flour, purchased in bulk from Costco. I was sent hurtling against the refrigerator with such force that this container of flour came cascading down like an Alaskan avalanche of snow. Covered in flour, I turned as white as a ghost, and so did the reindeer and Sam. I stumbled through the cloud of flour, trying to blink it out of my eyes, and still getting bashed by the out-of-control reindeer. Sam, whose jet black fur was now as white as a bedsheet, was still barking and snarling at the reindeer. At some point, I stubbed my toe against the foot of Dasher or Dancer or Prancer, whatever this guy was called. The point was, our feet connected, and it hurt. All covered in flour. I must have looked like the crazed version of the Pillsbury Doughboy, the abominable Doughboy. But somehow, some way, I managed to get the front door open. I opened it just enough to let the rampaging reindeer escape. Then I slammed the door shut. Wham! Keeping Sam inside the cabin, where he continued to bark wildly. With my heart still racing, I found myself back outside and back in the cold as I turned to face the reindeer. He'd already calmed down considerably and was just standing there, staring at me as if to say, "Okay, big boy, how about some more of those carrots?" At this moment, it hit me. I hadn't needed to worry about how cold this animal felt. Comet or Cupid or Donner or whatever his name might be, he's a reindeer. He has 2 layers of fur and he's built for the cold. How could I have been so stupid? So I retied the reindeer to the tree and retrieved the pen and paper without bringing this claustrophobic animal along. When I finally had the phone number from the reindeer's caller, I dialed it immediately in the person answered, "Brewster's Department Store." Brewster's Department Store? What was this reindeer doing with a phone number for Brewster's? One of the oldest, most revered establishments in Anchorage. Was he a frequent shopper? What was I supposed to say? "Hello, I've got a reindeer I'd like to return, but I don't have a receipt." Instead, I told the woman that my name was Tory Martin and that I lived in Bear Valley. I wanted to make it clear to this woman that I was a normal Alaskan, if such a thing existed, so she wouldn't think I was crazy when I said in my next sentence, "I have a reindeer at my house, and he has the department store number on his collar." "A reindeer?" the woman said, completely baffled. "Yes, with a collar with your number." "Oh, really?" she said. I could tell this woman wasn't buying it. Then I heard her shout to someone in the background, "This guy's got a reindeer at his house with a collar and our telephone number. The person in the background went nuts. "It's Rudy! It's Rudy!" She yanked the phone out of the other person's clutches and said, "You have Rudy?" "What's a Rudy?" I asked. "Rudolph," the woman exclaimed. "He's Mr. Brewster's reindeer." Rudolph, the reindeer, of course. I would have gotten to the name eventually. The name Brewster was also quite familiar. Charles H. Brewster was an Anchorage icon. He was the famed founder of Brewster's Department Store and an inductee into the Alaska Business Hall of Fame. You could usually find this gentle soul in his department store wearing a cowboy hat and cowboy boots, and he was famous for his line of winter clothing. Every 4th of July he dressed in silver and rode in the Anchorage parade on his Palomino horse, Honcho. But Charles Brewster was best known for his commercials, which always featured some young, energetic person talking a mile a minute about all of the store's great deals. Then the camera switched over to the elderly Mr. Brewster, who stared straight at the camera and said in his creaky voice, "And if I am in the store, I'll wait on you myself." I must have seen these commercials a million times. And every time I saw this elderly, slow-moving, slow-talking man tell viewers he'll wait on himself, I thought, who's got that kind of time? Glaciers move faster than that. The woman on the other end of the phone told me that Mr. Brewster was working a full shift today. Would I mind keeping an eye on Rudy until 5 o'clock? I told her, sure, but I'm babysitting a moose at 6, so make sure he doesn't dawdle. Only in Alaska. So along comes 5 o'clock, and Mr. Brewster calls me on his cell phone, telling me he's having a hard time finding my place. I told him to look for the big sign that says, "Danger, warning, 4-wheel drive only, change required, enter at your own risk." That reassuring sign means you're about to turn onto the road that leads to our cabin. As I led Rudy down the trail leading to the road, I fully expected Mr. Brewster to be waiting there with a horse trailer, or at least a pickup truck. So, you can imagine my shock when I saw Mr. Brewster drive in what appeared to be a Cadillac, a long, fancy car. Anything that isn't a broken-down Jeep looks like a Cadillac to me. I'll never forget what happened next. Good old Mr. Brewster got out of his car, dressed in his trademark cowboy hat, boots, and red and black checkered flannel coat. He walked right up to Rudy and wrapped him in a big bear hug. "Rudy," he shouted gleefully, "where you been, you old bugger?" Mr. Brewster was talking to Rudy as if he were one of his children, a long-lost son. Then it dawned on me, Rudy was the prodigal reindeer. Rudy once was lost, but now he's found. He was dead, but now he lives. In case you haven't flipped through Luke 15 of the Bible recently, it records the story of a son who had the audacity to demand his share of his father's inheritance. Now, in that culture, asking for the inheritance before your father passed away was tantamount to telling him you wished he was dead. So, with the money jingling in his pockets, the prodigal son hit the open road, settled in a distant country, and spent the money on every possible pleasure, which, if it had been me, would have been cupcakes and comic books. But he didn't count on the famine that soon hit the land, leaving him penniless and dying of hunger. Rudy the reindeer had also been looking for freedom when he broke away from his master. For the first hour or two, he probably was having a grand time, bounding around on the outskirts of Anchorage. But by the time Rob came across him, he was hungry and scrounging for food in a snow-covered landscape, and most likely wondering why he had ever left his master's side. Like the son in the Bible story, and like the reindeer, I too have led a prodigal life. I'd run away from my master, squandering my inheritance on raucous living. I'd run away from God, but in Alaska, I found that he hadn't run away from me. On the last frontier, God tracked me down. Which leads me to the end of the story of the reindeer. After hugging Rudy, Mr. Brewster turned his attention to me, standing there in my Carhartt overalls, the warmest, most durable clothes made. Carhartts are the most popular clothes in Alaska, and I wore a pair 90% of the time. "I'll tell you what," Mr. Brewster said, sizing me up, "you come to the store and I'll give you a couple of pairs of Carhartts as a thank you." I was thrilled. And as Mr. Brewster handed me Rudy's leash, he said, "Just a minute." He climbed inside the car, and I'm looking into the back seat thinking, how in the world is this guy going to fit a reindeer in the back seat of a Cadillac? And since when do reindeer have chauffeurs? I thought it was usually the other way around. When Mr. Brewster was finally settled in the driver's seat, he rolled down the window and asked me to hand him the leash. So I did. "All right, Rudy, let's go," he said. Then Mr. Brewster tipped his cowboy hat and began to drive away. Slowly he turned the car around and started down the road, holding onto Rudy's leash and leaving him alongside the car. "Stop by and pick up your overalls," he said, as I watched the car inch its way down the road. "And if I'm in the store, I'll wait on you myself." In the parable of the prodigal son, the father welcomed his wandering son home with open arms, sprinting from a long distance just to greet him. In Jewish culture back then, a nobleman always walked because that was a sign of dignity. But the prodigal's father didn't care. He ran as fast as his old legs would carry him. Let people think him a fool. He had a son to welcome home. In our culture, driving your car slowly, as Mr. Brewer was doing, would be viewed as similarly foolish. American cars are all about speed, but, like the prodigal's father, Mr. Brewster didn't care. He had a reindeer to welcome home, so he drove away, going only about 7 or 8 miles an hour with Rudy alongside. As Mr. Brewster drove off with Rudy trotting happily by the side of his car, and the sun just beginning to settle on the Alaskan horizon, I felt as if I were watching an old Western movie. I understood then that I was not just watching a foolish prodigal reindeer return to the safety and love of a kind, gentle master. I was watching my own life. God led me back to Him in the same gentle way Mr. Brewster had. God didn't drag me, kicking and screaming. He didn't force His love on me. He didn't pull me along faster than I was prepared to go. He took it slow. He had the patience that only a loving God could display. I believe that God tries to speak to us every single day through the events that happen to us, even if they're not as dramatic as a reindeer in your kitchen. When I was living in Alaska, I had fun looking back on each day and trying to find the spiritual significance in it. What else did I have to do with my time in a desolate, snow-covered cabin? We're all prodigals, finding our way back to God. We're all lost souls, looking for our way home. Of Moose and Men is the story of how I found my way back to God in Alaska. It's the story of how the ruler of the universe gave me a big bear hug, looked me in the eyes and said, "Where have you been, you little bugger?" And it's the story of how God will redeem, reclaim, and repurpose all of us for His perfect will. After all, God is always in the store, and He'll even wait on us Himself. And he refers to Luke 15. I'd like to read 3 verses from Luke 15. This is a different story Jesus tells, with the same moral, verses 4 through 7. "What one of you, having 100 sheep in the wilderness, if he loses one, does not leave the 99 and go after the one which is lost, until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost.' I tell you likewise, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just people who need no repentance." And thank you very much. Have a good week.